There were moments in an alpha's life when instinct failed him completely. For Hudson Wallace, that moment came on a bitter February evening when a hired carriage rolled onto his ranch, carrying the solution to a debt he'd never asked to collect. The Wallace Ranch sprawled across the Montana high country like a scar on the landscape, isolated, unforgiving, and exactly the way Hudson preferred it. He stood on the porch of the main house, his ornate wedding jacket feeling like a costume against the brutal wind. The letter from Riley Williams' family had arrived 3 weeks ago, written in the desperate handwriting of people who had run out of options. An Omega bride, 23 years old. Payment for an old debt. Hudson had stared at that letter for days, the firelight catching on the gold embroidery of the formal clothes he'd been forced to wear for the ceremony that morning. He was 35, scarred from years of enforcing territory law, and had long accepted that his ranch would die with him. The Wallace line would end because he'd become the kind of alpha that good Omegas avoided, cold, efficient, and more comfortable with violence than tenderness. But the ranch needed an heir. The territory expected it. And Hudson had learned long ago that duty mattered more than desire. When the carriage door opened, Riley William emerged like a ghost stepping into the living world. She wore an ivory dress that seemed too delicate for the harsh mountain air, her face partially hidden behind a lace veil that trembled with each breath. Hudson's alpha senses catalogued everything in an instant: the racing of her heart, the faint scent of fear beneath the traditional Omega fragrance oils, the way she held herself so carefully still, as if movement itself was dangerous. She was beautiful in that fragile, breakable way that made something primal in him want to either claim or destroy. Riley William. His voice came out rougher than intended, carrying across the space between them like a physical thing. She turned toward him, and for a heartbeat, their eyes met through the veil. Hers were the color of winter sky, pale, haunted, and holding secrets that had no business in someone so young. Yes, Alpha Wallace. Her voice was barely a whisper, trained into perfect submission. Hudson hadn't expected the surge of protectiveness that hit him looking at her, or the way his alpha instincts screamed two contradictory commands: claim her and shield her. He descended the porch steps, his boots heavy on the wood, and watched her flinch at the sound. Everything about her screamed trauma: the way she angled her body to watch his hands, how she held her small bag in front of her like a barrier, the shallow breathing that suggested she was fighting panic. He took her bag with deliberate gentleness, his fingers carefully avoiding contact with hers. "Let's get you inside. It's too cold out here." The walk from the carriage to the house was less than 50 yards, but Hudson felt every step of it. Riley moved like someone who'd learned to make herself small, each footfall quiet and measured. He noticed the way she startled when the wind slammed a shutter against the house, the way her fingers tightened on her skirts when he opened the door, the careful distance she maintained, as if she'd calculated exactly how close was too close. Inside, the house felt colder than the mountain air outside. Hudson set her bag down near the stairs and turned to face his new wife. The ornate jacket he wore, all gold embroidery and silver conchos, felt like a mockery of what this marriage actually was. Not a celebration. Transaction. A debt paid in human currency. "Your family said you needed protection," Hudson said, his alpha voice dropping to something less commanding. "That's what this is. Protection." Riley's hands were shaking where they gripped her bag. She looked up at him through that damned veil, and Hudson saw something flicker in her expression. Surprise, maybe, or disbelief. Like the concept of protection from an alpha was a language she no longer spoke. "I understand, Alpha." The words were perfectly rehearsed, perfectly empty. Hudson's jaw tightened. He'd been prepared for a shy, submissive Omega. The territory had sent him those before, testing whether the notorious Wallace Alpha had softened with age. But Riley wasn't just shy or submissive. She was terrified, and not the natural, instinctive wariness of an unbonded Omega meeting a strange Alpha. This was the bone-deep fear of someone who'd already learned what monsters could do. The ceremony was legal, but that doesn't mean... Hudson stopped, searching for words that had never come easily. Tonight, I need to know what I'm dealing with. No more secrets. No more pretty lies from your family about why they were so eager to send you here." Riley's breathing went shallow. For a moment, Hudson thought she might run, might bolt for the door and risk the frozen mountain rather than face whatever was coming. But instead, she reached up with trembling fingers and slowly lifted the veil from her face. The bruises had mostly faded. But the scars hadn't. Hudson's world tilted. His alpha vision catalogued every mark, every faded injury that spoke of systematic, deliberate cruelty. The slight crook in her nose from a break that hadn't set properly. The thin white line along her jaw. The way she held her left arm closer to her body, protecting old damage. "His name is Alexander Jason," Riley whispered, her voice cracking on the name. "And he's coming for me." In that moment, standing in his cold house wearing a wedding costume, Hudson Wallace felt something he hadn't experienced in a decade. Pure, incandescent rage at another alpha. Not the controlled violence of his work. Not the cold efficiency of a predator. But the white-hot fury of an alpha whose mate had been harmed. His mate. The bond hadn't even formed yet, wouldn't form until, if they completed the marriage. But his instincts didn't care about technicalities. They only cared that Riley William was his now, standing in his house, and someone had dared to break her. "He's not taking you anywhere." The promise came out like gravel, like a vow written in blood. Riley's eyes widened, and for the first time since she'd arrived, Hudson saw something other than fear in her expression. Hope was too strong a word. But maybe. Possibility. "I'm not going to touch you tonight," Hudson continued, forcing his alpha instincts back under control. "Or any night until you ask me to. But I need you to understand something, Riley. We're under Wallace protection now. That means something in this territory. It means Alexander Jason can come with an army, and he still won't get past me." He watched her process his words, saw the way she swayed slightly on her feet, exhaustion and shock finally catching up to her. Without thinking, Hudson stepped forward to steady her, then immediately pulled back when she flinched. "I'll take the barn tonight," he said quietly. "You need rest. We'll figure out the rest tomorrow." As he turned to leave, Riley's voice stopped him at the door. "Why?" One word, barely audible, but loaded with years of confusion and pain. Hudson looked back at his bride. His broken, terrified, impossibly brave bride, and gave her the only truth he had. "Because you're mine now. And I protect what's mine." He walked out into the frozen Montana night, leaving his new wife alone in the house, and felt his hands shaking for the first time since the war. Not from fear. From the absolute certainty that everything had just changed. Riley William had arrived with secrets that would reshape his life. And Alexander Jason, whoever he was, had just made himself Hudson Wallace's mortal enemy. The alpha cowboy had been sent a shy Omega bride. But what he'd received was a survivor who would teach him that true strength wasn't found in dominance. It was found in having something worth protecting, even if it meant burning the world down to keep it safe. The ceremony had taken place at dawn, before the ranch hands could gather to witness the spectacle. Hudson had insisted on that much dignity at least. The territory magistrate arrived in a black carriage that looked obscenely formal against the rough timber of the Wallace ranch, carrying documents that would legally bind two strangers for the rest of their natural lives. Hudson had dressed in the traditional alpha wedding attire that morning with hands that wanted to make fists instead of fasten buttons. The jacket was a monstrosity of burgundy velvet and gold embroidery, each silver concho catching the weak winter light like accusations. His grandfather had worn it. His father had worn it. Now Hudson stood in the main room of the ranch house, feeling like a fraud in a costume, waiting for a bride he'd never met to fulfill a debt he'd never asked to collect. The Wallace family had loaned Riley's father money 15 years ago. Enough money to save their failing homestead. The terms had been clear then, written in ink that didn't fade with time or good intentions. When payment came due and the Williams family had nothing left but pride and a daughter, they'd made their choice. They'd sent Riley. She'd arrived 30 minutes before the ceremony, stepping out of that hired carriage like a lamb being delivered to slaughter. Hudson had watched from the window, his alpha senses picking apart every detail. The way her family hadn't come with her, couldn't afford the travel, the letter had said, though Hudson suspected it was cowardice rather than poverty. The single bag that held her entire life. The trembling hands that gripped it like a lifeline. Now she stood across from him in the main room, still wearing her traveling dress because there'd been no time to change, and Hudson felt something dark and angry coil in his chest. Not at her. Never at her. But at the system that allowed this, at the families that used their children as currency, at the world that had put that look of resignation in her winter sky eyes. The magistrate cleared his throat. Alpha Wallace, do you accept this Omega as your mate, to protect and provide for according to territory law? Hudson's jaw tightened. The words tasted like ash. I do. Omega William, do you accept this Alpha as your mate, to honor and obey according to territory law? Riley's voice was barely audible. I do. There should have been a claiming bite. The magistrate's document called for it, that ancient tradition where the Alpha marked his Omega before witnesses, sealing the bond with blood and instinct. Hudson saw Riley's shoulders tense, saw her pulse hammering in the hollow of her throat, and made a decision that would probably invalidate the entire ceremony. We'll handle that part in private, Hudson said, his Alpha voice brooking no argument. The magistrate's eyebrows rose. Alpha Wallace, the ceremony requires. I know what it requires. Hudson's purple eyes flashed with enough dominance that the magistrate took an involuntary step back. And I'm telling you it happens in private. You have a problem with that, you can take it up with the Territory Council. But you'll do it from outside my property line. The magistrate swallowed hard, then quickly gathered his papers. The marriage is legally binding regardless. I'll note the exception in the record. When the carriage finally rattled away down the mountain road, Hudson and Riley were left alone in the oppressive silence of the ranch house. The ornate jacket suddenly felt like it was suffocating him. He could feel Riley's fear like a physical presence in the room, thick enough to choke on. You didn't have to do that, she whispered, still staring at the floor. The claiming. It's required. Nothing's required except what I say is required on this ranch. Hudson began unfastening the ridiculous jacket, needing to shed the costume, needing to breathe. You want to tell me why you're more terrified of a ceremony than you are of being alone with a strange Alpha? Riley's hands twisted in her skirts. For a long moment, Hudson didn't think she'd answer. Then, so quietly he almost missed it. Because ceremonies end. And then comes the part where you. She couldn't finish. Didn't need to. Hudson felt that white-hot rage again. The same fury that had hit him when he'd seen her scars the night before. Someone had taught Riley to fear the claiming bite. Someone had made her believe that the most sacred bond between Alpha and Omega was just another form of violence. Alexander Jason, Hudson said, the name tasting like poison. Riley flinched at the sound of it, her whole body going rigid. He said I was his, that my family owed him. When I refused her voice cracked. He tried to force the bond. My father stopped him but barely. That's when they contacted you. They thought any Alpha was better than him. Hudson carefully hung the wedding jacket on the back of a chair, giving Riley space, giving himself time to control the Alpha instincts that wanted to hunt down Alexander Jason right now and paint the territory red. They were right about that. But I'm not going to force anything on you, Riley. Not the bond, not the claiming, not a goddamn thing. Then why marry me? The question held genuine confusion. If you don't want, if we're not going to. Because you needed protection. Hudson turned to face her, keeping the width of the room between them. And because Alexander Jason is exactly the kind of predator I spent 10 years hunting. The debt's paid either way. What happens between us beyond that is nobody's business but ours. Riley looked up at him then, really looked at him, and Hudson saw her trying to reconcile the man in front of her with whatever monster she'd been expecting. He knew what she saw, A scarred, dangerous alpha who'd earned his reputation through violence and efficiency. But maybe, just maybe, she could also see the truth underneath. That Hudson Wallace might be a killer, but he'd never been a predator of the weak. "I can't give you what wives are supposed to give," Riley said, her voice steadier now. I'm broken, Alpha Wallace. Whatever you were promised, whatever you were expecting." "Hudson." He interrupted her gently. "My name is Hudson. And you're not broken. Damaged maybe. Hurt definitely. But not broken." "How can you know that?" "Because broken things don't run. They don't survive. They don't stand in front of a strange alpha and tell him the truth about their scars." Hudson moved to the window, giving her even more space. "You want to know what I was expecting? I was expecting a transaction, a legal arrangement, an heir for the ranch and a warm body in the house. What I got instead was a survivor who's been through hell and still had the courage to walk into another alpha's territory." Outside, the sun was climbing over the mountain peaks, painting the snow-covered ranch in shades of gold and shadow. Hudson's ranch. His territory. And now, whether she believed it yet or not, Riley's home. "I'll show you to your room," Hudson said. "You can rest. We'll figure out the rest as we go." "My room." Riley's confusion was evident. "Don't married alphas and omegas share?" "When you're ready. If you're ever ready." Hudson finally looked at her again, letting her see the truth in his eyes. "I meant what I said last night, Riley. You're under my protection. That includes protection from me." For the first time since she'd arrived, Riley's expression shifted into something that might have been the beginning of trust. It was fragile, tentative, and would shatter at the first wrong move. But it was there. "Thank you," she whispered. Hudson nodded, then headed for the door, already planning which of the ranch's defensive positions needed reinforcing. Because Alexander Jason would come. Men like him always did. And when he arrived, he'd learn exactly why Hudson Wallace had earned his reputation as the most dangerous alpha in the territory. The debt bride had been delivered. The marriage was legal. And somewhere out there, a predator was already planning his revenge. Let him come, Hudson thought. Let him try. If this story has held you this long, subscribing is how you help it continue. Thank you. Now back to the story. The first day passed in careful silence. Riley stayed in her room while Hudson worked the ranch, checking fence lines and avoiding the house like it might burn him. By the time darkness settled over the mountains, he'd run out of excuses. The ranch hands had gone to the bunkhouse. The horses were fed. The work was done. And tradition demanded that an alpha claim his omega bride on their wedding night. Hudson stood in the barn staring at nothing, his hands gripping a stall door hard enough to make the wood creak. Every instinct he possessed was screaming contradictions. His alpha nature wanted to go to Riley to cement the bond, to make her his in every way that mattered. But the man he'd become, the one who'd seen too much cruelty, too much abuse of power, that man knew exactly what walking into her room tonight would make him. Another monster. When he finally entered the house, Riley was waiting in the main room. She'd changed into a white nightgown that made her look even more fragile against the darkness outside the windows. Her hair was down, falling over her shoulders like pale gold silk. She'd clearly prepared herself for what she thought was coming, and the resignation in her eyes made Hudson's chest feel like it was caving in. "Riley." Her name came out rougher than he intended. "I'm ready, Alpha." She stood perfectly still, hands clasped in front of her, every line of her body screaming submission. But underneath it, Hudson could scent the terror, could hear her heart racing, could see the way she'd positioned herself near the stairs, close enough to run if she needed to. Ready for what? The question seemed to confuse her. For my duties. As your wife. As your omega. She took a shaking breath. "I know what's expected. I won't fight you." Those 4 words, "I won't fight you," hit Hudson like a physical blow. This was what she'd been taught. What Alexander Jason had tried to drill into her. That resistance was futile, that an omega's body belonged to her alpha regardless of consent, that her only value was in submission. "Go to bed, Riley." Hudson's voice came out flat, controlled, betraying none of the fury churning underneath. "But the claiming." "I said go to bed." Riley flinched at the alpha command in his tone, and Hudson immediately regretted it. He forced himself to take a breath to gentle his voice. "Please, just go to your room. Lock the door if it makes you feel safer." "I don't understand." Her confusion was genuine, tinged with something that might have been fear of a different kind, the fear that she'd done something wrong, that she'd failed already. "Did I do something to displease you? I can try harder. I can be better." "Stop." Hudson held up a hand, needing her to stop talking before he completely lost control. "You haven't done anything wrong. But I need you to go upstairs right now, before I say something that'll scare you worse than you already are." Riley hesitated, clearly torn between obedience and confusion. Finally, she moved toward the stairs, her steps quiet and measured. She paused at the bottom, looking back at him with those winter sky eyes. "Why are you being kind to me?" The question was so soft, so broken, that Hudson had to close his eyes against it. When he opened them again, Riley was still waiting for an answer she clearly didn't believe she deserved. "Because you deserve kindness," Hudson said simply. "Now go. Please." He waited until he heard her door close, then the quiet snick of the lock engaging. Only then did he allow himself to move, his hands shaking as he poured a glass of whiskey he didn't drink. The amber liquid sat untouched on the table, while Hudson struggled with instincts that had never failed him before but were failing him spectacularly now. An hour passed. Then two. Hudson sat in the darkness of the main room, listening to the house settle, trying to convince himself that he'd made the right choice. That leaving Riley alone on their wedding night wouldn't invalidate the marriage or give Alexander Jason legal grounds to reclaim her. That he could live with being the first alpha in Wallace history who couldn't complete a simple claiming. The sound of footsteps on the stairs brought his head up. Riley stood in the doorway, still in her white nightgown, her hair disheveled like she'd been tossing in bed. Her eyes were wide, uncertain, and Hudson could smell the confusion rolling off her in waves. "I can't sleep," she whispered. "I keep waiting for you to change your mind, to come upstairs and..." She wrapped her arms around herself. "Why haven't you?" Hudson stood slowly, keeping the table between them. "You want the truth." Riley nodded. "Because when I look at you, I see someone who's been hurt by alphas who thought they had a right to your body. I see scars that shouldn't exist. I see fear that no omega should ever have to feel toward her mate." His hands gripped the back of the chair. "And I'll be damned if I become another name on that list of men who hurt you. But you're my alpha now. The law says." "I don't give a damn what the law says." Hudson's voice dropped to something dangerous, not directed at her but at the world that had taught her these lies. "The law also said Alexander Jason had a claim on you because your family owed him money. The law said your father could trade you like property to settle a debt. You want to keep quoting law at me, Riley, or you want to hear the truth?" She stared at him, something shifting behind her eyes. "The truth. The truth is that you're terrified. The truth is that every time I get within 5 feet of you, I can smell the fear coming off you in waves. The truth is that I'd rather sleep in the goddamn barn for the rest of my life than force myself on an omega who's already been through hell." Hudson's voice cracked slightly. "So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to the barn. You're going to stay in this house. And maybe someday, if I'm lucky, you'll stop looking at me like I'm about to hurt you." Riley's breath hitched. "You're choosing the barn over me? I'm choosing to give you a choice." Hudson grabbed his coat from the hook. Something no other alpha has bothered to do. He was halfway to the door when Riley's voice stopped him. "Hudson." It was the first time she'd used his name. He turned back slowly. Riley stood in the middle of the room, tears streaming down her face, but her voice was steady. "Alexander Jason never slept anywhere but next to me," he said. He said an alpha who didn't claim his omega every night was weak. That distance meant I wasn't valuable enough to keep close. Hudson's jaw clenched so hard he thought his teeth might crack. Alexander Jason is a predator and a liar. Then why does your choice feel like rejection? The question was raw, vulnerable, and Hudson suddenly understood. Riley had been conditioned to measure her worth by how much an alpha wanted to claim her. By refusing, he wasn't giving her freedom. He was confirming her worst fear that she was broken, worthless, undesirable. "Come here," Hudson said quietly. Riley hesitated, then moved toward him with small, cautious steps. When she was close enough, Hudson slowly, carefully, reached out and placed his hand over her heart. She flinched but didn't pull away. He could feel it hammering against his palm, could feel her trembling. "You feel that?" he asked. "That's fear. Real bone-deep terror. And until that fear is gone, until you can stand next to me without shaking, until you can look at me without calculating escape routes, I'm not touching you as anything more than your protector." He dropped his hand. "That's not rejection, Riley. That's respect." Riley's tears fell faster now, but something in her expression had changed. The resignation was gone, replaced by confusion and something that might have been the beginning of understanding. "I don't know how to not be afraid," she admitted. "Then we'll figure it out together. But we'll do it at your pace, not mine. Not traditions. Yours." Hudson pulled on his coat. "I meant what I said. I'm sleeping in the barn tonight. But not because you're not valuable. Because you're too valuable to rush." He made it 3 steps out the door before Riley called after him one more time. "Hudson." "Thank you." The alpha cowboy stood in the freezing Montana night, his hands shaking worse than they had in 10 years, and realized that protecting Riley William was going to be harder than any bounty he'd ever hunted. Because she wasn't just fighting external monsters. She was fighting the ones that lived in her own head, whispering that she wasn't worth protecting. As he settled onto a pile of hay in the barn, surrounded by the warm smell of horses and leather, Hudson made himself a promise. He'd sleep out here every night if that's what it took. He'd prove to Riley that an alpha's strength wasn't measured in domination, but in restraint. That real power was choosing not to take what you wanted when taking it would break something precious. The wedding night had come and gone. The claiming hadn't happened. And somewhere in the main house, Hudson hoped Riley was finally sleeping without fear. For the first time in a decade, the ruthless alpha had been brought to his knees, not by violence or defeat, but by the simple act of choosing compassion over conquest. The blizzard hit 3 days later with the kind of violence that only Montana winters could deliver. Hudson had seen it coming in the bruised color of the sky, in the way the horses grew restless, in the particular bite of the wind that promised death to anything caught unprepared. He'd spent the morning securing the ranch, bringing the livestock closer to shelter, stacking firewood by the house until his shoulders ached. Riley watched from the window as he worked, her face a pale oval behind the frost-covered glass. They'd barely spoken since the wedding night, existing in a careful silence that was less uncomfortable than it was tentative. Hudson still slept in the barn. Riley still locked her door. But something had shifted between them, some invisible thread of understanding that neither knew quite how to acknowledge. By noon, the snow was falling so thick Hudson couldn't see the barn from the porch. The wind howled like something alive and angry, rattling the shutters and finding every crack in the house's defenses. He came inside covered in snow, his hands numb despite his gloves, and found Riley standing in the main room with her arms wrapped around herself. "It's bad," she said. "Not a question. It's going to get worse." Hudson stamped snow off his boots and moved toward the fireplace, building up the fire until heat rolled through the room in waves. "We'll be stuck inside for at least 2 days. Maybe 3. He saw the fear flash across her face before she could hide it. The prospect of being trapped in close quarters with him. No escape routes, nowhere to run. Hudson's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice even. "There's food enough. Water enough. You'll be safe, Riley." "I know." But her voice shook when she said it. The first day of the blizzard passed in tense quiet. Hudson stayed in the main room, maintaining the fire, occasionally checking the windows to gauge the storm's fury. Riley moved between the kitchen and her bedroom like a ghost, bringing him food he barely tasted, then disappearing again before conversation could start. By nightfall, the temperature had dropped so severely that even the roaring fire couldn't fully drive back the cold. "You should stay down here tonight," Hudson said as Riley headed toward the stairs. "The upstairs rooms don't hold heat like this one does. You'll freeze." Riley stopped, one hand on the banister, and Hudson could see her calculating, weighing the risk of cold against the risk of proximity to him. "I'll take the chair," he added. "You can have the sofa near the fire." She nodded slowly, then retrieved blankets from upstairs, creating a small nest on the sofa while Hudson settled into the worn leather chair on the opposite side of the hearth. The fire crackled between them, and outside the wind screamed its fury at the world. Hudson woke sometime near midnight to the sound of whimpering. His alpha instincts went on high alert immediately, scanning for threats before his conscious mind fully caught up. Then he saw Riley on the sofa, tangled in her blankets, her body rigid and her face twisted in terror. She was still asleep but caught in the grip of a nightmare so vivid that Hudson could smell the fear sweat, could see her lips forming words he couldn't hear. "Riley!" He kept his voice low, unthreatening. "Riley, wake up!" Her eyes snapped open, wild and unfocused, and for a moment she didn't seem to see him at all. She saw something else, someone else, and the sound that came from her throat was pure animal panic. "Get away from me!" She scrambled backward off the sofa, her blankets falling away, her hands coming up defensive. "Please, I'll do anything, just don't." "Riley, it's Hudson. You're safe. You're at the ranch." He stayed absolutely still, hands visible, voice steady despite the rage building in his chest at whatever she was reliving. "Come back to me. Come back to now." But she was too deep in it, her breathing coming in ragged gasps, her whole body shaking. Hudson watched her slip further into the flashback and made a choice. He slowly moved to his knees, making himself smaller, less threatening. "Riley, listen to my voice. Feel the fire. You're warm, you're safe, and Alexander Jason is not here." He kept talking, soft and constant, describing the ranch, the storm, the reality she'd left behind. "Feel the floor under your feet. That's Montana pine. Feel the heat from the fire. That's burning cedar. You're in my house, and no one can touch you here." Gradually, painfully, Riley began to come back. Her breathing slowed. Her eyes focused. When she finally saw Hudson, really saw him, her face crumpled. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry," I thought. Her voice broke. "For a moment I was back there, and he was." "I know." Hudson stayed on his knees, every instinct screaming at him to go to her, to pull her into his arms and promise her she'd never hurt again. But he'd learned patience in the last few days. "You're safe now. I swear to you, Riley. Alexander Jason will never touch you again." "How can you promise that?" The question held desperate hope. "He's powerful. He has money, connections. When he finds out where I am, let him come." Hudson's voice dropped to something dark and absolute. "Let him bring his money and his connections and his hired guns. This is Wallace territory. And on my land I am the law. He wants you back. He'll have to go through me. And I promise you, Riley, he won't." Something in his tone must have reached her, because Riley's trembling began to slow. She looked at Hudson, still on his knees, still giving her space, still waiting for permission, and her expression shifted into something vulnerable and aching. "Why do you care?" she whispered. "I'm just a debt payment. Just property you inherited." "No." The word came out fierce, harder than Hudson intended. "You're not property. You're not a payment. You're my wife. And more than that, you're someone who deserves to feel safe in their own home." Riley's eyes filled with tears. "I don't know how to feel safe anymore. I don't know how to stop being afraid." "Then let me teach you." Hudson held out his hand, palm up, an offering, not a demand. "One touch at a time. one moment at a time. But only if you want to. For a long moment, Riley stared at his outstretched hand like it might bite her. Hudson watched emotions play across her face. Fear, longing, hope, terror. Then, so slowly he almost didn't see it happen, she reached out. Her fingers brushed his palm first, testing, ready to pull back. When Hudson didn't move, didn't grab, didn't do anything but wait, Riley's touch grew firmer. She placed her hand in his, and Hudson carefully, gently, closed his fingers around hers. The touch was electric. Not the forced chemical bond of an alpha claim, but something more fundamental. Human connection. Trust given freely instead of taken by force. Hudson felt Riley's hand trembling in his, felt the warmth of her skin, and something in his chest that had been frozen for 10 years began to thaw. "Your hands are shaking," Riley said softly. "Yeah." Hudson didn't bother denying it. "You're the first person I've touched like this in a long time. The first person I wanted to touch like this." "Why?" "Because every other touch in my life has been about violence or duty. This is different." He met her eyes across the firelight. "This is choice." Riley's tears spilled over, tracking down her cheeks, but she didn't pull her hand away. Instead, impossibly, she moved closer. Not much, just a few inches, but enough that Hudson could feel the warmth of her, could scent beneath the fear something new, something like trust. They stayed like that for hours, hands clasped, the fire burning low between them while the blizzard raged outside. Hudson told her about his childhood on the ranch, about the war, about the years of bounty hunting that had carved away his humanity piece by piece. Riley, haltingly, told him about Alexander Jason, about the slow escalation of control, about the night she tried to refuse him and learned that refusal was a luxury omegas weren't allowed. When dawn finally came, gray and snow-choked, they were still holding hands. And when Riley finally fell asleep, curled on the sofa with her fingers still tangled in Hudson's, she didn't have nightmares. The blizzard would rage for 2 more days, but inside the Wallace ranch house, something warmer than fire had begun to burn. Hudson watched Riley sleep and felt his hands steady for the first time since she'd arrived. She was safe. She was his. And he would burn down the entire territory before he let anyone take that away from either of them. The scent of safety, Hudson realized, smelled like cedar smoke and fresh snow, and an Omega who was finally learning that not all alphas were monsters in alpha's clothing. Spring came to the Montana high country with reluctant grace, the snow retreating inch by stubborn inch up the mountainside. The blizzard had been the first of many that winter, each storm driving Hudson and Riley closer together until the careful distance they'd maintained began to feel less like protection and more like denial. Hudson still slept in the barn most nights, but now Riley would sit with him in the evenings, their conversations growing longer, their silences more comfortable. And sometimes when the nightmares came, she would reach for his hand in the darkness and hold on until dawn. It was 6 weeks after the wedding when Riley's scent changed. Hudson noticed it immediately, that subtle shift in her natural fragrance that every alpha was hardwired to recognize. The sweet, rich undertone that meant fertility, that meant possibility, that meant his Omega was carrying his child. He'd been checking the fence line when it hit him, the knowledge slamming into his consciousness with enough force to make his hands go still on the wire he'd been mending. Riley was pregnant. They hadn't completed the bond, hadn't shared a bed. But that night during the worst of the blizzards, when Riley had woken from another nightmare and crawled into Hudson's arms seeking comfort, when their desperate need for connection had overridden fear and caution, that night had been enough. Hudson found Riley in the kitchen, kneading bread dough with an intensity that suggested she was working through more than just flour and water. She looked up when he entered, and something in his expression must have given him away because her hands went still. "You know," she said softly. "Not a question. How long have you known?" 3 days. Maybe 4. Riley's hands moved to her stomach in an unconscious gesture of protection. "I wasn't sure how to tell you. We never talked about what happened that night. I didn't know if you..." Hudson crossed the kitchen in 3 strides and did something he'd been too careful to do before. He pulled Riley into his arms, held her close, and let her feel the way his heart was hammering against his ribs. "A baby," he said against her hair. "We're having a baby." Riley's body went rigid for just a moment. Old fear, old conditioning, then slowly melted against him. Her arms came up around his waist, tentative but real, and Hudson felt something fundamental shift between them. This wasn't just about protection anymore. This wasn't just about healing from past trauma. This was about building something new, something that belonged to both of them. "Are you happy?" Riley's voice was muffled against his chest. Happy doesn't even begin to cover it. Hudson pulled back just enough to see her face. "You've given me something I never thought I'd have. Family. Future. Riley, The sound of hoofbeats cut through the moment like a knife. Hudson's alpha instincts went on high alert instantly. Multiple riders, moving fast, coming from the eastern pass. His hand went to the rifle mounted above the door even as he moved Riley behind him. "Stay inside," he ordered, his voice dropping into that alpha tone that expected immediate obedience. "Lock the doors. Don't come out until I say." "Hudson." "Now, Riley." She must have heard something in his voice, some primal warning that transcended words, because she didn't argue. Hudson waited until he heard the lock engage, then stepped out onto the porch with his rifle in hand. 12 riders formed a semicircle in front of the house, their horses breathing hard from the climb. They were dressed too well for ranch hands, armed too heavily for casual visitors. Hired guns, every one of them. And in the center, sitting on a black stallion that probably cost more than Hudson's entire herd, was a man who could only be Alexander Jason. He was everything Hudson had expected and worse. Polished, handsome in that refined way that spoke of wealth and privilege, with a kind of smile that never reached his eyes. His alpha presence rolled across the yard like oil on water, slick, pervasive, and fundamentally wrong. "Hudson Wallace." Alexander's voice carried across the space between them. "I've heard stories about you. The great alpha enforcer of the Montana Territory. Tell me, do the stories mention that you're also a thief?" Hudson's grip on the rifle tightened. "Get off my land. Not without what belongs to me." Alexander's smile widened. "You have something of mine. A pretty little omega with more debts than sense. Riley William. Or should I say Riley Jason. We had an arrangement, you see. Long before her family sold her to you like discount livestock. Riley Wallace." Hudson's correction was cold enough to frost the air between them. "And she's not going anywhere." "Ah, but that's where you're wrong." Alexander gestured to the men flanking him. "You see, I have 12 witnesses here who will testify that Riley fled her legal obligations to me. That she owes me a bonding debt that predates your little transaction by 3 years. Territory law is very clear about prior claims, Wallace. They supersede subsequent marriages, especially unconsummated ones." Hudson's jaw clenched. Of course Alexander had done his research. Of course he knew they hadn't completed the bond. "The marriage has been consummated." The lie came easily, naturally. "Riley is my mate in every way that matters. Your claim is void." Something dangerous flashed in Alexander's eyes. "Then you won't mind if I verify that with the Omega herself. Bring her out, Wallace. Let's hear her say she chooses you over me." "Not happening." "Then I'll assume you're lying." Alexander's hand moved to the torch one of his men carried. "Here's how this works. You have until sundown to bring Riley out to me. Peacefully, voluntarily, the way a good Omega should come to her true alpha. If she's not standing in this yard when the sun touches the horizon, my men will burn every structure on this ranch to ash. The house, the barn, the bunkhouse. All of it." Hudson's finger moved to the rifle's trigger. "You threaten my home, you threaten my mate, and you think I'm going to let you ride away from here? You're outnumbered, outgunned, and operating on the wrong side of territory law." Alexander's smile turned cruel. "But by all means, Wallace, start something. Give me an excuse to claim your land along with my Omega. The Territory Council would love to hear how you murdered 12 men over a female who was never legally yours to begin with. The worst part was that Alexander was right. Not morally, not ethically, but legally. If Hudson started shooting, he'd be the aggressor. The council would strip him of his territory rights, maybe even execute him for murdering other alphas. And then Riley would have no protection at all. Sundown, Alexander repeated. Choose wisely, Wallace. The Omega or everything you've built here. Either way, I'm leaving with what's mine. The riders wheeled their horses and thundered back down the mountain pass, leaving Hudson standing alone on his porch with a rifle in his hands and murder in his heart. Behind him, he heard the door unlock. Riley stepped out onto the porch, her face pale but determined, one hand still pressed protectively over her stomach. I have to go with him, she said quietly. If I don't, he'll destroy everything. He'll kill you, Hudson. And I can't. I won't let that happen. No. The word came out flat, absolute. You're not going anywhere. You heard him. He has the law on his side. He has 12 guns. Hudson, you can't fight this. Hudson finally looked at her, and Riley took a step back from the expression on his face. It was the look of a predator who'd finally been given permission to hunt, of an alpha who'd been holding back his true nature and was done pretending to be civilized. Watch me, Hudson said. Alexander Jason wants a war. He's about to learn why I stopped bounty hunting. It wasn't because I got soft, Riley. It was because I got too good at killing. He pulled Riley back inside the house and locked the door. They had until sundown. That meant they had 4 hours to prepare for a siege, to turn his ranch into a fortress, and to show a wealthy predator what happened when he threatened a Wallace Alpha's family. The predator had returned. But what Alexander Jason didn't understand yet was that he hadn't just threatened an Omega. He'd threatened an Omega carrying an Alpha's heir. And that, Hudson thought as he began loading ammunition and checking firing positions, was the kind of mistake that ended bloodlines. The sun crawled toward the horizon with malicious slowness while Hudson and Riley turned the ranch house into a fortress. He positioned rifles at strategic windows, stacked ammunition within easy reach, and explained firing angles with the clinical efficiency of someone who'd fought wars before. Riley listened with an intensity that would have surprised him 6 weeks ago, but now he understood. She wasn't the broken Omega that Alexander had tried to create. She was a survivor learning she had claws. When they come, they'll try to flush us out with fire, Hudson explained, checking the shotgun's chamber. But this house is built from Montana stone and green timber. It'll smoke before it burns. That gives us time. Time for what? Riley's hands were steady as she loaded cartridges into a rifle magazine, movements precise from Hudson's teaching during the long winter nights. Time for them to make mistakes. Time for me to thin their numbers. Hudson's purple eyes met hers across the arsenal they'd laid out on the kitchen table. And time for you to remember that you're not prey anymore, Riley. You're a Wallace. And Wallaces don't run. When Alexander Jason's riders returned at sundown, they found the ranch house dark and silent. No Omega stood waiting in the yard. No Alpha came out to negotiate. Just the wind moving across empty space and the growing shadows of a mountain dusk. Light it up, Alexander's voice carried across the distance, and Hudson heard the satisfaction in it. The predator thought he'd won. The first torch hit the barn roof. The second hit the bunkhouse. Flames crawled up dried wood, casting dancing shadows across the yard. Hudson watched from the window, counting men, calculating positions, waiting for the moment when confidence would turn to carelessness. Now, he whispered to Riley, and together they opened fire. The first 3 shots dropped 2 men before Alexander's hired guns even understood they were under attack. Hudson's rifle sang its deadly song, each shot deliberate and final, while Riley covered the eastern approach with surprising accuracy. The remaining men scattered, diving for cover, their easy job suddenly becoming a nightmare. The house! Alexander screamed from somewhere in the darkness. Surround the house! But Hudson had fought on this land for years. He knew every shadow, every firing angle, every place where the terrain betrayed intruders. When two men tried to flank from the north, Riley's warning shot sent them scrambling. When another attempted the south approach, Hudson's bullet found him in the shoulder, sending him howling back into the night. The siege lasted 3 hours that felt like 3 lifetimes. The barn burned itself out. The bunkhouse collapsed into embers. But the stone house held, and inside it, an Alpha and his Omega fought with the desperation of people protecting something worth dying for. Alexander Jason finally showed himself when his numbers had been cut in half, stepping into the firelight with a pistol in each hand and rage twisting his handsome face into something monstrous. "You can't win, Wallace," he shouted toward the house. "I'll burn this entire territory before I let you keep what's mine." Hudson's response was a bullet that tore through Alexander's left shoulder, spinning him backward into the dirt. The Alpha hit the ground hard, his weapons falling from nerveless fingers, and for the first time since he'd arrived, real fear crossed his face. Hudson emerged from the house like something from a nightmare, his rifle trained on Alexander, his purple eyes glowing with alpha dominance that made the remaining hired guns step back involuntarily. This was Hudson Wallace at his most dangerous, not the civilized rancher, but the bounty hunter who'd made his reputation painting the territory red. "Here's what's going to happen," Hudson's voice carried across the burning yard with lethal calm. "You're going to drag yourself and what's left of your men off my land. You're going to tell the Territory Council that Riley Wallace is under my protection and any claim you think you had died the moment you threatened her. And if I ever see you on this mountain again, I won't aim for your shoulder." Alexander clutched his wound, his face pale with blood loss and fury. The council will hear that you laid siege to a legal Alpha household with hired guns, that you threatened to burn an Omega alive, that you tried to steal a pregnant mate." Hudson's smile was sharp enough to cut. "You want to explain to them how any of that follows territory law?" Behind Hudson, Riley stepped out onto the porch, rifle in hand, standing tall in the firelight with one hand pressed protectively over the life growing inside her. She looked at Alexander Jason, the Alpha who'd broken her, controlled her, convinced her she was worthless, and her voice rang out clear and unafraid. "I'm not yours anymore. I never was. I'm Riley Wallace. And you will never touch me or my family again." Alexander's remaining men helped him onto his horse, their movements hurried and fearful. As they rode away into the mountain darkness, Hudson knew they wouldn't be back. Men like Alexander were predators, but only against prey that couldn't fight back. Riley had proven she was no longer prey. 6 months later, as autumn painted the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, a baby's cry echoed through the rebuilt Wallace Ranch. Hudson held his newborn son with hands that had once only known violence, tears streaming down his scarred face as Riley smiled up at him from the bed, exhausted and radiant and finally, completely safe. "He has your eyes," she whispered. "Purple. Like mountain twilight. He has your courage." Hudson carefully placed their son in Riley's arms, then settled beside them both, his family, his world. "What should we name him?" Riley looked down at the baby, then up at the Alpha who'd chosen protection over possession, patience over conquest. "Legacy. Because that's what we've built here. A legacy that isn't about debt or duty or obligation. It's about choice. About two broken people who found a way to heal each other." Hudson pulled them both close, breathing in the scent of his mate and his child, feeling the weight of the past finally lift from his shoulders. The Wallace Ranch had seen its share of blood and pain. But it had also witnessed something rarer. Two people learning that strength wasn't found in dominance or submission, but in the courage to be vulnerable with someone who promised never to use that vulnerability as a weapon. Outside, the Montana wind sang through the repaired barn and the rebuilt bunkhouse. Inside, an Alpha cowboy held his shy Omega bride and their newborn son, and finally understood that the greatest battles weren't won with rifles and violence. They were won with trust, with patience, and with a simple promise that love was something you protected, not something you took. The debt was paid. The predator was gone. And from the ruins of their broken pasts, Hudson and Riley Wallace had built something that would last for generations, a legacy written not in blood and fear, but in safety, choice, and the cry of a baby who would grow up knowing that true power came from protecting the ones you loved. The alpha cowboy and his shy omega bride had survived their first night together. Now they would spend the rest of their lives proving that survival was just the beginning of their story. Thank you for joining the pack today. If this story pulled you in, make sure to subscribe and tap the moon bell so you never miss the next alpha destiny. And tell me in the comments, who should we follow next under the full moon?